Hello there, I'm Chris Heilmann. I'm a principal program manager at Microsoft, and I want to talk today about web tooling for today and tomorrow. It says JavaScript, there's a few JavaScripts in there as well, but I always see tooling as more holistic than just one language, because we build things using several languages and several techniques coming together for our end users out there. So all the resources that I'm going to talk about will be available at this link, aka MS.JS Web Tooling, after this talk. So you don't need to scribble down things. You can just listen to me and see what's going on. And if you like, if we agree or if we disagree on things. So let's talk a bit about what web tooling was like and where it's going in the nearer future. The web debugging journey has been quite rough. We started with alert, and that was the only thing we had. And it was quite annoying because when you had, for example, a loop, you had to press enter like several times going in there. Sometimes you got stuck in an endless alert, which was back then rebooting the computer, which is nothing you should ever have to encounter as a developer. But that was the thing we had. We had document write, which we also used to do little messages in the screen or like read out like dimensions and things like that. And there was actually in 997 or something like that, there was also a Windows script debugger and Microsoft script editor. The only person I've ever seen use this and also tell people in trainings was Douglas Crockford when I worked with him at Yahoo. But it was around there, and that was like already a very interesting approach to JavaScript, to do like step-by-step debugging, which most people still haven't embraced, and I'm going to come back to that later on as well. The big breakthrough came when Firebug came around. Firebug was an extension for Firefox. It was not actually maintained by Mozilla. It was Chris Pedrick, I think it was. And it was a runaway success. It was just gorgeous. So the first time to be able to see the rendered DOM, see the changes in CSS, and do all the things to proper inspect what you're doing and see what the browser is doing for you. And that led to developer tools being embedded in browsers, and all of them come with developer tools nowadays. Like you got Safari developer tools, you got the Firefox ones, and you've got the big Chromium ones, which are in Chrome and in Microsoft Edge. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today are the Microsoft Edge Chromium ones, because that's the ones I'm working on. But I don't mind which one you use. I love that people have different browsers and different ideas. And I also love that we have differentiation in that space, that different browser makers have different focus on what they want to do. But the good thing is that all developer tools are in browsers nowadays. You can press F12 or Command-Shift-I to open them. And for us as developers, this is amazing. For end users, it can be confusing. Like often you see people accidentally opening them and then be confused about, oh my God, I got a terminal in my machine. What's going on here? But I think it's great that we have this opportunity. There's even an editor built in. You don't need actually to do anything else but having a browser to get started as a web developer. And generally, we're in good shape. We got evergreen browsers that get updated every few weeks. There's daily builds of browsers, and I hope there won't be any coming up right now with my machine, which it always does when you give a presentation. There's good platform adoption, like a lot of things that you get excited about and you see like, oh, did you know this new CSS feature? In the past, took us years to actually get, but nowadays you can say like after 3 or 4 months, most browsers will have embraced it and it will be able to use. Of course, there's always outliers like UC browser or people having to support old Internet Explorer. But I think we shouldn't keep back because of that. It's still, most of these things can be used progressively and you can actually use them just to enhance things rather than just relying on them. We've got open and extensible editors. So the editing space is written in TypeScript as well, and we can embed editors in the browser. Things like CodePen, things like the Monaco editor that we have in Microsoft, or even back then brackets. This was great that I can use a full editor in the browser without having to install and maintain yet another app on my machine. We got hosting with version controlling and hooks like GitHub, or also CodePen, also JSBin and all these things out there. You don't need to actually maintain your own server any longer, just to show a quick example to people when you ask, for example, for issues. Like you coded something, you don't know why it's broken. It's very easy to set up a JSBin or to set up a CodePen, send that around to your friends and say like, can you help me with that? And most of these even have live editing tools that you can work together, and that's great. We also got frameworks a minute. There's a new thing to replace the old web, and we get super excited about that one, but we're not going to go into this one at this talk. What I'm more annoyed about is that you see these kind of things. Every time you open the developer tools and you just surf around, your console is full of stuff. It's full of things that you don't understand, that you probably as a developer, you're not quite sure if you can fix or if you're confused about, and if it's really your job to do. But it's painful to see just how many simple things are being done wrong in lots of websites out there. Considering our space that we're in, considering the state of the debugging environments and the state of the web in general, this is actually disheartening. It's kind of annoying that we are there. It's disappointing considering the state of tooling and documentation, because back in the days, you had to buy books, you had to buy courses, but most of the time, nowadays, you just go to MDN and you go to any other resource and you look things up and you got information by the truckload. You know why things are breaking, but still people don't do it. And that's actually to the chagrin of our end users. They have the problem with it then. And yeah, imagine like being a new developer, open developer tools and seeing all these issues come up. They're basically, first of all, you feel overwhelmed. You're like, oh my God, I will never be as clever to know what all these things mean. But you also see that like, well, if the cool websites use it and don't care about it, why should I put more effort into it? Why should I be a quality developer when it's actually okay to do these kind of things? So there's a lot of reasons because for the state of the web as it is right now. Forgiving browsers is one thing. As a browser, we cannot break anything. Everything has to be working. Like 25-year-old websites have to render, and the coolest, newest thing has to render as well. So a lot of times browsers are super forgiving and try to fix things for you that they probably shouldn't. But we cannot just break the web. We said like the web is going to be open and allowed everybody to be in there, and any code can run on it. What we can do is stop illegal things or stop like dangerous things to be run. But that's about it. Also forgiving languages, JavaScript and others like CSS is super forgiving. Like if a line of code doesn't work, it just jumps to the next line of code, and that's totally fine. That's an inbuilt resilience of the language itself. And JavaScript and the convenience methods of JavaScript are quite bizarre as well. Like, for example, the global ID thing I never liked. Like you put an ID on an HTML element, it becomes a global JavaScript variable. So a lot of people don't actually get a hook to the ID element in the page, but they're already relying on that the browser does it for them, which is not necessarily true for all the browsers out there. Another thing I call full stack overflow development, which is like I'm actually finding something that is working. I go to Google, I find a Stack Overflow answer. I just copy and paste the answer, the first one, and hope that everything works. I might change some numbers around, but it's good enough. And it's good enough in most of the cases. But the problem is that I don't know what that code does. I don't learn anything from it. And and of course, there could be all kinds of security issues or performance issues in that code. It's just a fast, quick answer. I had a lot of discussions with people about that like we shouldn't discourage new developers just by finding something and copying and pasting it. Like W3 Schools is another one of those that has that problem that explains the how to you, but not the why. But it's also a question if every new developer is interested in the why or should be knowing about the why. So we're not there, but the Stack Overflow development is a thing that people just basically copy and paste things and don't know what's going on and add on top of things. And that's why we have a lot of code on the web that doesn't necessarily do much. There's third-party interference, there's ad package and trackers and all these things. Like often you write a really cool website and then the marketing department puts all kind of like telemetry and stuff on top. And out of a sudden you have like a 20 megabyte JavaScript file that you don't know where it came from. And you're still being actually told as the developer to fix. There's platform by committee. So every new year, some new content management system will be used in your company and you have to use that, or a framework and you have to use that. And there's focus on a high impact audience as well. Like often we say, oh, we need to support iOS because this is where people spend the most money. We need to support this kind of environment because that's where our audience lies. And it's sometimes a very outdated environment, which means you have to put a lot of extra code in there that doesn't necessarily do much for the web, but for that audience that brings in the money. And it's kind of okay. I mean, we have to get paid somehow. And developer tools are overwhelming. When I started as a product manager on developer tools, I didn't know just how deep it goes. Like there's thousands of panels and subpanels and menus and little things to know about. And I'm spending a lot of time documenting that right now because I think we shouldn't overwhelm people. But at the same time, a lot of the stuff is in there because we thought it was a great opportunity at that time, and we never realized we take it out there. If you look at the usage numbers, a lot of people are using like 2 or 3 bits of the developer tools, and the others just lay there in case we ever need them. And that's confusing for beginners. Like if I get a tool that looks too complex to me, I get disheartened and I don't actually know what I'm doing. So I want to make sure that we're getting into a space where beginners are not overwhelmed by the tools that they're supposed to use to give them insights. Now, when it comes to development, we're working in 3 different environments. We're working in an editor or an IDE. That's where most of the code is done. That's where we develop things. Then we jump to the browser where we test and tweak things, and like we write some CSS, and then we go to developer tools and change the colors around and see that the pixels are perfect and these kinds of things. That's what we use the browser developer tools a lot for. And then once we're happy with the changes, we go to the terminal, and that's where we do our version controlling, our continuous integration, continuous development, and our build scripts to actually generate the final websites. And this is actually very common that we do these things. That's a very common workflow. It's also an opportunity to get bogged down in customization. Like the amount of blog posts I see where people talk about which is the perfect terminal font or what is the best theme to make you a professional developer. And instead of concentrating on the final web product, we actually get bogged down on which browser to use, which IDE to use, and which terminal to use, and which terminal version to use. And I find that it's interesting. Of course, we're geeks. We love to do these kind of things. But it can also be overwhelming for beginners. Like, I just want to get started with a web product, and I don't want to tweak my editor to be perfect for the next half year. And it's an endless cycle of context switching. So we're jumping from the IDE to the browser to the terminal, and then create the web product. Then we go back from the browser to the IDE once we did some changes in the developer tools. And it doesn't seem much, but actually jumping from one app to another is a cognitive overhead that actually impacts our way of working. We are not as effective as we could be because our brain needs to get rewired every 5 minutes or something to jump from one environment to the other. And of course, the big forgotten part about it is once we get excited about tweaking our browsers and IDEs, we actually don't learn things anymore. We don't actually read documentation. We don't find out about best practices. We just basically copy and paste things and get too excited about what's out there and what we can do instead of what the end user actually needs. I think there is an interesting concept of that developer tools shouldn't require expert knowledge. They should make you an expert over time. When you use them, you should learn things, what not to do and what to do and why something happens. I want to take that whole holistic learning and being effective as a developer together in the developer tool rather than just being an extra on the side. Like once you publish something, then you go look it up and read it, which we probably don't do. And best practices and documentation should be part of the tool and not something you find elsewhere. These are things that actually should be part of your development flow rather than something that you need to do once your development flow is over. So let's get onto that journey to that utopia that I want. The first thing we did is noise reduction. As I said in the beginning, you open the developer tools and you see your console and all the messages that are not yours, that you can't do anything about, and you wonder what's going on. So that's why we have console filtering now in the developer tools. That's almost in all of them in the browser. So you can just say, only give us the user messages. These are also only the things that you wrote with console.log. Stop showing errors, stop showing warnings, only show the verbose ones, and so on and so forth. So this already helps you with a lot of like, okay, I don't see all the things that I cannot do anything about anyways, because that's my colleagues doing it. So this also makes you a happier developer by just filtering down to the needs. But one thing you see in there as well is something new or newish, which is called issues. So there's a message called some messages have been moved to the issues panel, and it shows there's 244 issues. And that's not uncommon. That's most websites have a lot of these issues. And some of them are actually quite easy to fix and to change. Now, these issues panel that I'm going to show in a second are powered by something called Webhint. Webhint is an NPM package. It's also an online service that does testing of your code for accessibility issues, performance problems, if it's ready to be an app, like if the manifest is there and so on, compatibility with standards and cross-browser compatibility, common pitfalls to avoid, and security issues. And this one you can use in your CI/CD. You can use an NPM package and run it against a web server, or you can actually embed it somewhere else. And that's what we did with the developer tools and also in the editor, which I'm going to show in a second. Webhint is open source. It's maintained by the JS Foundation, so it's not a Microsoft product, and you can take a look at it if you want to. You can also tweak it. It's highly customizable. You can set up your own hints, and you can run it behind a firewall if your code, for example, is not available on the web. Now, in the issues panel, we sorted these issues by type. So you can say, like, I don't really can't do anything about security, so don't show me those. I only want to fix the accessibility ones. I only want to fix the performance ones, and so on and so forth. You also have a tick box in there to include third-party issues or to not show them. So if something comes from your ad package or from your tracking package, you can turn that off because it's not your job to fix it. And still, it would be in the back of your head, like, I need to fix this right now. Now, when you go deeper into this accessibility panel, for example, you get information why something is and learn more links. So you don't only say, it doesn't only say it's an error, but it says like that error means this, and this is why you should fix this. And here is how you can fix it. If you want to learn even more about it, here's another link to go to actually learn about it. You also might see, if you look at the screen, there's this View in Elements link here as well. So that's another thing. You can click on that link, and it opens up the Elements view of the developer tools. So you don't only need to know how to fix it, which you get explained, but you also get sent to the place where you can fix it. And hopefully over time, these things will show up less because it becomes second nature to you, or a muscle memory to actually learn what's going on there. Now, this is when something already happened. What about preventing you from making mistakes? How about helping you out to not write bad code, which is a good thing too. Now, Webhint is also an extension for Visual Studio Code. You can install it for that one as well. And then it comes down in the panel as the problem. So there you have like a to-do list of what to fix. And that does the same thing. It explains to you why and explains to you where to go to fix it. You don't get sent to different parts of VS Code because it doesn't have the same functionality as the developer tools. But this is already a really good way. And I found that all the linting tools like ESLint for JavaScript, CSSLint also show up in that problems pane. And it's really nice to actually clean up your code bit by bit so that your to-do list of wrong things is going away. You also have live linting in the code. So you got these little squiggly lines being shown under code when there's a problem with it. And you can roll your mouse over it. And then it shows you, like in this case, for example, that a downloader is not supported by Internet Explorer or iOS Safari. So you shouldn't rely on it, but you should also find another way for those browsers to do it. And that's great because back in the day, we had to go to MDN, we had to go to Can I Use and learn about these things. But having it in context while you're writing your code prevents you from making stupid things, and that's a great thing to have. There's also little touches in VS Code that I think go a long way. This is code here, for example, called do from stuff. Bad method name, never use that, just for the demo here right now. But you can see it's kind of grayed out, and the reason is that it's not being used yet. But as soon as I now add an event handler that calls the do form stuff, it gets this lighter yellow. So a lot of themes in VS Code show you unused things as grayed out. And that's a great opportunity to actually find out what you're not using, or if you found old code that you put lots of things in that you wanted to build later, which we never get to, you can see what to delete. And that's a very simple and subtle little thing, but it made me so much more effective realizing like this is not used, why it's still in there, and so on and so forth. We also thought about visual tools and workflows, because often there's things where the syntax of CSS especially is kind of overwhelming to people. So we thought, like, how can we make this easier for you to understand what you're doing? One big thing is CSS grids, one of the newer CSS things. So what we have in there is like this little lozenge, as my American colleagues always call it. I always need to cough when I hear it. That little thing called grid. And if you actually hover over that or click it, you get an overlay on the page showing you all the information about that grid. And when you click on it as well, the CSS on the bottom scrolls to that part of the CSS grid where it is defined. So you can see the changes, but you can also tweak them immediately in the browser. And that helped a lot of people actually get their head around what's going on with CSS Grid. CSS Flexbox is similar. And you can see in the screencast right now what it does. You can click on that one, and then you get the overlay showing you what the flex settings mean and how they're actually changed. And you can go through the whole tree, clicking them on and seeing which part is actually be done with each Flexbox setting. And again, the CSS on the bottom scrolls to the part of the CSS that is responsible for that. So you don't have to go to the editor and hunt for it any longer. In the editor itself, in the CSS editor, when you start typing, we put these little source indicators in there right now as well. So all the different alignments, you might not know what they mean. So it's already great that we have auto-completion, so you don't need to type all these things and know the syntax. But now you also get a little information what that alignment means and what the effect of it will be without having to do it and reload the page and see what's going on. So that already shows you what a certain setting is good for. Another thing we saw people stumbling over a lot is typography. So we have this little font editor now in the developer tool. So every time there is a font definition in a CSS selector, you get this little AA icon that you can click on, and that opens up a graphical font editor. So there you can choose the different font families. It automatically realizes which fonts are being used on the page or which generic fonts you want to choose from. And you can tweak the CSS properties. So you can use these sliders to change the font size and change the line height and so on. You can even convert between different formats. So if you have, for example, pixels and you want to convert them to EM, you can do that with that tool right built into the browser as well. And it generates the CSS code for you to copy and paste. Another big thing that I haven't put in the slide deck yet is that we now have new features in the CSS editor to copy and paste either the selector or the full selector or the full CSS. So it's much easier than in the past you had to highlight it with your mouse and copy and paste, but now you can also context click it and just copy and paste that way. I think it's also important for people to make it easier to go deeper, because the go-to debugging thing that we all do is console.log. And that also leads to these massive logs in the developer tools in every live website out there. And it's not necessarily a good experience for your end users. And it's also a very inefficient way of developing, if you think about it, because you're still putting information where you are in the code. We're still thinking in a level of like basic programming line by line, and it's not necessarily the case. And there's actually much more to debugging than just knowing at that time what that certain value is. So for me, breakpoint debugging is the biggest step that made me more efficient as a developer. But it's a huge problem for beginners, and it seems like this overwhelming thing to start embracing. I mean, you can set breakpoints in the editor or in the browser or other debugging environments. You can also say breakpoints in the editor itself. And sometimes you're just like, okay, my generated code is somewhere else, so this breakpoint is going somewhere else. The line numbers don't match, so you need source maps and so on and so forth. There are much more work up front, but I think once you got your head around breakpoints, it makes you so much more efficient and actually is so much easier to do things. And of course, you have no problem anymore having a console log in there that shouldn't be in there. Because the big thing about breakpoints is that it stops the code execution. You don't like slip through and like get lots of like log files and then you have to scroll up again and see what's going on. But you get an end-to-end picture of what's going on. You can see where the data came from, how it got converted, and what it's affecting in the DOM, for example. You're not likely to litter the web with yet another console message as well. Another interesting one is live expressions. If you haven't looked into that one as well, that's also a really good replacement for lots and lots of console logs. But the problem that I still see is that a breakpoint environment is confusing to somebody who's a visual thinker or somebody who comes from the front-end development world. And that's why I think one underused item that we had for a long time is DOM breakpoints. If you haven't seen that one yet, you can actually go to your HTML interface, what you generate, and you can right-click it and say inspect. That one will get you to the elements view, and in the elements view, you have this highlighted, and you can see this overlay there, giving you all kind of information about what's going on there. But you also have that ... menu on the highlighted line, and I understand that people don't find it because it's really tough to realize. But when you click that one, you get things like break on, and it could be subtree modification, attribute modification, or node removal. So if you now say, for example, subtree modification, and you just start using the interface, out of a sudden you get into the breakpoint environment. It already highlights the sources tab for you, and it sets a breakpoint, or it gives you a breakpoint environment where you are without having to set a breakpoint by hand. You can do that from the interface to the sources editor rather than having to do it in the sources editor in the first place. And you can see, for example, those brown things here next to the out and the information that you get. This is what you would write a console log for. And this is why I think these environments are gorgeous, because they also already give you the information without having to write a console log. How often have you written a console log to run it, to go back and write another 5 console logs to give you more information and inspect other variables that are actually being affected by that one. And this environment shows you that. And I think a DOM breakpoint is a great way to get into that without having to start at the breakpoint environments. And you got the call stack, you got the scope, and you can go through it bit by bit. And again, you see the mouse events here and the buttons. So you find all the things that are going on without having to write yet another console log. Now, another thing we talked about was context switching, jumping from browser to editor to terminal. And this seems to be like a cool thing. Oh, I know all 3 of them, but it makes us less effective than it should be. And I love that, for example, Visual Studio Code did leaps and bounds in this area and made it much easier for me to do things. So the first thing that I love about Visual Studio Code is it has Git integration. Version controlling is a wonderful thing. If you ever encountered like a repository with like 15 folders called final version, really final version, this time we mean it kind of thing. Version controlling is great because it means you don't make mistakes that cannot be undone. You never lose any of your code that you would with like zip files or something like that. But it's tough. Git is kind of hard to understand, and there's lots of opportunity to get bogged down in the syntax of Git itself. So having an editor inside the browser that actually does all the Git stuff for me and allows me to concentrate on the messages, on the commit messages, means I use version controlling the way it was meant to be, not the way I actually thought it would be the right thing to do. So, or going to the command line and learning all the Git commands first. So this makes you concentrate on the things that really make a difference for the next user that has to look at your code and get a commit message. And it also takes all the complexity of Git out of the workflow. You will have to learn it at one time or another, but I think as a beginner, it's great that you don't have to. There's also a built-in terminal. So this one, you can actually point to all kind of contexts to actually debug. And that's another thing. You don't have to jump to the terminal to just run a build command or something. You just do a command backtick, open the thing, start typing the command backtick, go back to your code. And that's wonderful. Now, browsers are changing or have changed in the last years a lot as well. They can be automated. So you got WebDriver, you got things like Puppeteer, you got things like Playwright. So a lot of times a browser is not something that the end user uses, but just a piece of code running in the background that you throw data at, you get data back. So creating screenshots, continuous integration, continuous testing, all of these were possible now that browsers can be automated rather than just being a thing that end users have. They can also be embedded, like the web views that we have can be embedded in other applications to give you like a browsing experience for the web without having to write one yourself. And one of my biggest bugbears is Android apps that have their own outdated web view, which doesn't have, for example, my cookies, my information. It's super annoying that people ship with their own web view without using an evergreen one, because that is a lot of like complexity for developers out there as well. Now, Visual Studio Code allows for extensions. That's probably its biggest success factors. Like people were able to put their functionality into the editor that wasn't in there in the first place. So I was thinking, or we were thinking about a year ago, why don't we merge the two? Why don't we take the great development experience of Visual Studio Code with the terminal and the Git integration and the developer tools, where you go to tweak anyways, where you go to change your CSS, where you change the color pickers and so on and so forth. Why don't we make one thing out of that? And we did that with the extension called Microsoft Edge for the Microsoft Edge tools for VS Code. I had to put all the names in there, sadly enough. And that's great. It basically means that you don't have to switch contexts anymore. You stay within the context of Visual Studio Code, and you still get the functionality that you expect from the browser. This is what it looks like in a screencast. So you connect to an instance of the browser, and it gives you a view of the browser, and you can then do the inspection, and you can click on the CSS link and do the editing in the VS Code in the VS Code browser itself. VS Code editor itself. You know that in the browser, like if you click on the CSS file name, it opens the sources tab with that embedded editor. It's a great editor, but it's kind of old, and you're already in an editor. So why don't we just send you back to the context that you came from? This is a full browser experience in VS Code. This is not a stream or a video or something. You can interact with it. You can change things. You can type things in. And it's excellent when you put it on another screen or something like that. You still get the developer tools and the editing suite in one go. This is not quite like an IDE. I don't like IDEs. They're too much. But this just gives you what you need at the time. For now, we didn't put everything in there, but we made it easy for you to actually launch a browser. You don't have to install a driver any longer. You don't have to install a debugger. It all comes with the extension itself. Right now, you can inspect, edit, and tweak the DOM structure like you would in the browser. You can inspect network requests. That's something that people also wanted to do. And you can interact with the browser directly, so you don't have to go to another browser window and type things in there. You can sync the changes with your code. If you set up source maps and you set up your product the right way, then you could tweak the CSS and it changes your Sass, for example, and that's excellent. And you can choose an own browser window or an embedded one. If you're on a Mac, the embedded one, the headless version, is the better one because the other one is a bit buggy still. And that's a problem of macOS that we're still working on right now. So this already gives you most of what you want to have. But what about another context that I haven't talked about? Often you see people working with APIs and having to change API calls on the fly. So this is the network pane. And what we thought about, like, how about we extend that one to give you yet another context? So you can right-click now and edit and resend. This is something that Firefox had for a while as well, but we went all in and actually gave you a network console right now. So there you can tweak all the settings in there. You can import and export API environments. You can actually do something like tools like Postman or Insomnia or other API tools do directly in the browser. And this is something we're considering bringing into the environment, into the VS Code extension as well. Right now, that's only in the browser as an experiment. But please tell us about what you think about that. Now, one thing that most people don't realize is that the developer tools are actually written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it's a wonderful experience to, as a web developer, to be completely free of dependencies. Like, you can use all the cool new technology of the web because you're right inside the browser and right inside the engine. And the fun thing is that you can debug the developer tools using the developer tools. What does that look like? Well, you open developer tools, Command-Shift-I on a Mac or F12, Control-Shift-I on Windows. And then you make sure that they're actually in full screen. So activate the ... menu and select undock into separate window. That way you get the developer tools as a full screen experience and not just like a left side or a bottom. And then when you press Command-Shift-I again, you open another instance of the developer tools that now debugs the other developer tools. This is actually how we built them. And this is also how we automated our tests. So you can find out how these developer tools were built just by using another instance of the developer tools on top of them. So you can see what we've done and how we could do it better and what we find out. This also works in other environments like Windows Teams, Microsoft Teams, for example. Another Discord is another thing that I found that has the developer tools already built in as well. So it's great to actually see how things are working and peeking under the hood. So what's next for this environment? I think it's important that you tell us. All of this is, well, the VS Code extension is actually on GitHub. So please file issues. Tell us when you want something else. Tell us when something is wrong. And we would love to hear about how you use these things and what else we could do to make it more effective for you to be a developer and not having to jump from one context to another. We also have detailed developer tools explainers on GitHub. So this is what's coming in the nearer future. Like, tell us where you learn about new features. And again, you can file issues. You can tell us that we're going totally in the wrong direction or that something else is already doing that for you. We would love to know about that one. And in general, it's all about making things for you. I showed you a lot of stuff that we learned, and all of that came from user feedback. Nothing of that was like something we like, oh, we should probably do that and people will love it. This is all about like people asking us, oh, I can't do that. Wouldn't it be good to have something to make that easier? And that's the feedback that we want. And please give us feedback. This is me and my team. Edge Dev Tools on Twitter is where we are. Zohair is a colleague of mine, Rachel, Erica. We all do different parts of the developer tools. I'm Code Poet on Twitter, and you can also reach us by clicking that icon directly in the developer tools that does a screenshot of the current context that you're in, so we know where you get stuck. So that's all I had. I think there is a lot to be done in the developer space. I want to make it easier for end users and for beginners to get started with it. But at the same time, I don't want to let experts miss out things. So please communicate. Please tell us what you need, and we're going to build it. Thank you very much.